So it's a good idea for us to understand how this mechanism, you could say, I don't really like the word mechanism because it sounds mechanical, how this thing that Ramesh used to call the body-mind mechanism, anyway, how that functions as an expression of that, and how that is expressed through it, and where this kind of idea of separation came in. So it's a good idea to kind of understand how this body works, and particularly how our nervous systems work, just to understand how when we become more aligned with that, not that we were ever separate in the first place, but there was a sense of coming more into alignment with that, how that then manifests through the body in terms of how our things like our nervous system and other systems in the body respond to that. And I don't think there's enough emphasis put on this in a lot of spiritual traditions. Well, in some traditions there is, particularly the ones that involve somatic kind of experiences, things like yoga, for example, Tai Chi, and all those. So when we look at it from the beginning, so when we were, we started life, when we started life, probably before conception, and a lot of people have memories of that through regression, of deciding to come into form and all that. But in terms of our physical form, so this starts, as you know, with an egg, which is a single thing, an egg. And then obviously at conception you get a merging between the sperm and the egg. So you have two, this is where duality comes in, two merging into one. So when they merge into one, they become one. They become a one-celled organism, no longer two. So that's a very interesting thing that happens. And then in the first few days after conception, you get a fairly rapid cellular division. And then you get the forming of this outer shell, which is interesting, called a zona pellucida. So this shell forms fairly hard barrier between what's outside and what's inside. So again, this is a very interesting dynamic in terms of what we're talking about with non-duality here. This sense of perhaps individuality maybe starts around this time. And then at around 14 days or so, you get the beginnings of the formation of a human being. So you get the emergence of what is called the primitive streak, which forms this line, this groove through an uprising groove through this bundle of cells. So it creates a left and a right and a front and a back and a top and a bottom. And then further on from that, you get the development of the brain, the spinal cord, and most importantly the heart, which slowly begins to beat, and the heart forms on the top of the head. So it's something like up here initially. And then you get this process of kind of enfoldment where the heart enfolds in on itself and comes in like this, and begins to rest where it will eventually end up. So this enfoldment happens. This is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's like our brain, our nervous system, if you like, bowing to our heart. And that's So then we get limb buds and all those other things begin to form. And our nervous system. And our nervous system is very interesting. Again, it's well worth studying, and I'll go into this in more detail in other videos, because to understand how our nervous system works, particularly in response to spiritual experience. And people like Stephen Porges has done some amazing and beautiful work on this, in explaining how we are essentially social creatures, that our nervous systems have been developed over millennia, thousands and thousands and thousands of years, to be relational. He calls it our social engagement system, or our social nervous system. So we have this need to relate to another. So again, this is something interesting around the dynamic of non-duality, this need to relate to another, something outside of ourselves. And then Stephen Porges also talks about our more primitive parts of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, and the what we call the fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. And again, this is very, very interesting, how we can shuttle between these states of the nervous system, between being more social, and then being more in our sympathetic, which is basically around fight or flight, but it's also around things like anger and being more confrontational and getting upset and all these things. And then also in terms of spiritual, the spiritual life, you could say the parasympathetic, which is in evolutionary terms the most primitive part of our nervous system, primarily the old part of the vagus nerve. Very, very primitive, and this is to do with, it's sometimes called the rest and repair system. It's activated a lot in therapy, and things like, we may feel feeling more relaxed, feeling more calm, feeling like our digestion might start more, tummy gurgling, feeling sleepy, feeling cold. So these are parts of our parasympathetic nervous system, very ancient. And again, this is associated a lot with dissociation. In trauma work, if someone is very traumatized, they will tend to go more into a dissociative or deeply parasympathetic state, as opposed to a sympathetic state, which is more active, trying to get away. So in a parasympathetic state, this is more withdrawal and sitting it out, and that's associated with things like coldness and, as I said, dissociation. And sometimes some spiritual experiences can be almost feel a bit like dissociation, because we can feel out of touch with our bodies, we can feel out of it generally. I'm not saying this is always true by any stretch of the imagination, but sometimes dissociative states can feel strangely good in the sense that we're not really feeling anything at all. But that state is not one where we are in touch with our bodies. And this is why in a lot of spiritual traditions the body is taken seriously. So to be able to sense into the body as an expression of the divine, as an expression of consciousness, and completely at one with consciousness. In other words, there is no differentiation between any cell or any movement or anything any sensation, anything arising, anything falling away, between all those things and God, the divine. So this is why it's important to pay attention to the body. And dissociative states are very interesting because they tend to cut us off from the body. They tend to numb our feelings. They tend to numb our physical sensations. They tend to make us less aware of our surroundings. When we're in a strongly dissociative state, we tend to be not very safe, like driving a car, because we're not very aware of our surroundings and things like this. So so this is why being aware of our body and things like what we call self-regulation. In other words, where is our nervous system at this time, because it will tend to shuttle between those three things constantly, between a more socially interactive state where we naturally want to interact with people. And this is very interesting because this is our natural state, and our natural state for our nervous systems is relational, is like outside. And that's very interesting from the point of view of spirituality, which is essentially that whole thing, that sense of an individual relating to something else, is essentially illusionary. So this is a very interesting dynamic between our natural propensity of the way that our bodies work and our nervous system work to go out. So it creates a kind of interesting dynamic. And then, as I say, we're constantly shuttling between that, and usually we can kind of track when we're in a more sympathetic nervous system state, because we'll tend to be more, you could say, unsettled. Our mind will be more active. Some people in a highly sympathetically charged state will say they can't switch their mind off, that it's going round and round and round. And we will tend to be more fast. And then we're shuttling between that and a parasympathetic state, which we obviously tend to go to more when we're relaxing. Certainly in some aspects of meditative practice, we also go into a deeply parasympathetic state. I'm not saying that is dissociative all the time. There can be an element of that sometimes, but again, we can still be in touch with our bodies in a parasympathetic state. Our breathing will slow down, our heart rate will slow down, our blood pressure will slow down, all these things, and we go into more of a relaxation state. So I'm just saying this because it's very interesting to kind of understand these processes in terms of spirituality. You could say the reality of consciousness and the reality of our beings as human beings, with a particular physiology and anatomy and a particular way that our nervous systems work and those tendencies. So I will carry on with this in another video blog, because there's a lot more to say about it. Thank you.